Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the School of Policy Studies weekly speaker series, Policy Talks. My name is Riley McDonald, and I am a member of the MPA class of 2019. I will be the host for this week's policy speaker series, for which we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Myles Corak. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting. The territory Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Now, it is my privilege to introduce a major figure in the analysis of inequality, poverty, and social mobility, Dr. Myles Corak, who will be delivering a talk entitled The Making of Canada's Poverty Reduction Strategy, or I see the title has now changed. Dr. Corak is a professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Prior to taking on this post, he taught at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Corak has published 3 books and a truly dizzying number of articles for both academic and popular audiences. In addition to his scholarly accomplishments, Dr. Corak has been heavily involved in the creation and analysis of public policy in a variety of fields, both within and outside of public service. He's worked for Statistics Canada and more recently for Employment and Social Development Canada as its economist in residence. And he has been affiliated with numerous public policy think tanks, including the Broadbent Institute, the C.D. Howe Institute, and the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Questions of social mobility and equality of opportunity are of paramount importance to Canada and of substantial interest to burgeoning policy analysts. Considering that this year's Policy Challenges class, which we all just finished 20 minutes ago, is focused on drafting recommendations for addressing poverty in Canada, understanding the role of policymakers in developing ideas to address social and economic inequality indicators is at the forefront of all of our minds. So we are exceedingly lucky to have Dr. Corak here with us to provide his expertise on the topic. And as in the past, we will be using Slido to ask Dr. Corak questions. For those unfamiliar with it, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website at slido.com or using the app on your phone. The code for today is MPA19. Please ask questions throughout the talk, and they will show up on the screen when the PowerPoint presentation is over. Also, if you don't have a question, still take a moment to vote on others' questions that you are also interested in having Dr. Corak answer. And we will also take some questions from the crowd. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Myles Corak.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm genuinely pleased to be here, particularly in a student-led venue. I was a student here myself, and I say this with full knowledge that my thesis supervisor is in the room. The 3 years I spent here in the 1980s were probably the most miserable of my life. But it taught you perseverance, and I hope you persevere and reflect back on your years here as happily as and constructively as I do on mine. As Riley mentioned, I'm going to spend some time basically walking through the Canadian poverty reduction strategy at the federal level, which was introduced by Minister Duclos earlier this year. I was the, quote, economist in residence for the calendar year 2017, working in the Deputy Minister's Office at Employment and Social Development Canada, and moved between the Minister's Office and the public service during that year, and settled on contributing to this file. So in some sense, I suppose we could advertise this as sort of an insider's view of the making of it. But I think it's more just sort of an opportunity for me to sort of step back, reflect on it, and sort of give you some context and background and highlight some of the major themes that motivate the report, as well as to sort of suggest some possible next directions for the poverty reduction strategy. So you can obviously download and read the strategy, but I'll basically walk you through that document. I should say also that it was quite impressive to have the kind of minister that we do have at Employment and Social Development Canada now. Jean-Yves Duclos is a noted labor economist who was elected in the last federal election. And it's shown, I think, a remarkable leadership style. One of the innovations of this federal government was to public release all of the ministerial mandate letters. And his mandate letter looks pretty long and challenging, and he's devoted an amazing amount of energy. And one of the highlights in the mandate letter was to produce a poverty reduction strategy. So it was just an honor for me to help him and his team out in trying to reach that goal. And so it's his leadership that has really sort of driven this process. And yeah, it sort of taught me some lessons about making the switch from academia to politics, and maybe we can reflect on that a little bit. Let's see. So just what are we trying to do here? I don't know the nature of the courses you take, but we often speak of evidence-based public policy. And by that, I sort of understand trying to develop an ecosystem, an environment, an evidence base for understanding a problem, for guiding action, and for monitoring progress. And I think the federal poverty reduction strategy certainly helps us to understand the problem. And its main goal is also to set up a framework to monitor progress. In some ways, it may give us guidance for action, but it doesn't really tell you what to do. It doesn't underscore the causal forces that will move poverty rates. And you can imagine different politicians having different views on guiding action. And although guiding action is also part of evidence-based policy, the PRS doesn't explicitly tell you what to do. Okay? So I'm going to focus my presentation mostly on sort of how its role on understanding a problem and how it can be used to monitor progress and the hopes that we have for it, and touch on the very end on how we might guide action. Well, we do all this with the intention of running a government. And I'll hint at how that might be a part of the way this government is thinking. So what exactly, in sort of a very overview way, does the poverty reduction strategy do? First, it sets an official poverty line and associated targets. So for Minister Duclos and for other stakeholders in the community, this was a very important ask and a very important result. In the context of that, it also puts together a set of supporting indicators. And these, I think, should be given just as much attention because they help us understand or appreciate the way in which we should meet those targets. And finally, and perhaps this is a little bit more of a hope, but it does sort of set up a contract, at least an implicit contract with future governments. The intention is that this is a policy that will live through successive governments and continue to impact the lives of Canadians. So just as we have targets or goals and visions in mind concerning government finances or inflation rates, maybe too we should have goals and visions in mind that span across governments that reflect society with respect to poverty and poverty reduction. So I'll work through each of these three themes, focusing mostly on the discussion around the official poverty line and the targets. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this book by Michael Barber. He tells us how to run a government. And his book is rich on checklists. And this is sort of the Bible of basically, if you will,
I'm not sure if it is or not, evidence-based policy. And it certainly forms a backdrop, I think, to the thinking of many senior officials in the current federal government. And Barber's checklists come from his experience during the Blair-Brown years in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the United Kingdom. And for me, at least, this was those years were, and those experiences are an important backdrop to the thinking of the Canadian public poverty reduction strategy. After all, Tony Blair did explicitly stand up in 1997 and lay out a vision for the country to eliminate child poverty in a generation. And the mechanics of the public service were used to further public policy to do that. And Barber was part of that whole discussion. The idea of developing indicators to reflect that vision and monitoring progress with those indicators. So I remember actually living in London for a summer around this time. And every time you picked up, every time the statistical agency, or I think it was the Department of Works and Pensions, would release the poverty figures, there would be this graph on the front page of The Guardian with this indicator saying, oh, the government is missing the target, or the government is doing well. The government basically puts its feet to the fire and asks society to continue to push it in a certain direction. And so this idea of continually monitoring progress is sort of part of the ethic or understanding of that. So that experience, and the UK did make significant progress, I think it's fair to say, and although outsiders see it more rosy than insiders, in reducing child poverty. But that's not the only sort of backdrop for the thinking that went into the poverty reduction strategy. The poverty debate in Canada has been going on for years, if not decades, and many, almost all, not all, but almost all of the provincial governments have put forward poverty reduction strategies. And that's also echoed in some of the municipal governments. So getting a scan of that kind of development was also very important as a backdrop. And there are particularly articulate and well-argued poverty reduction strategies in Quebec, in Ontario, and in some of the municipal governments. The City of Edmonton's document, in my view, really stood out as an impressive document. And this is all, of course, informed by a rich discussion amongst various stakeholders. All right? So let's sort of begin with talking about the official poverty line and targets and answer what on the face of it seems like a simple question. Just how many people in Canada are poor? All right? And we can't move policy forward until we have that basic fact on the table. I don't know if you saw a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently, but the authors, Phil Graham and somebody else, I forget, basically argued that the poverty rate in the United States was hovering around 3% now, according to the way they measure it. That government can't do much about it anyways, and we should probably start cutting back on what are called entitlements in the United States as a result. So a lot revolves around that statistic because it's going to frame the policy discussion, and the framing is, as you know, extremely important. In Canada, it's not there isn't a straightforward answer to that question, or historically there hasn't been. In part, consensus is hard to reach because academics, and now I'm speaking mostly about economists, don't have the capacity to fully pronounce on that question. If you read the economic literature on poverty, a lot of it takes the threshold as given and talks about different indices on how you would summarize the circumstances of people below the threshold. But where to actually draw the line isn't discussed as explicitly or as often in the theoretical literature. The other reason this is not a simple question, or hasn't been a simple question to ask, is that there's just a lot of legacy here. Statistics Canada has sort of, through fits and starts, for different reasons, produced 3 different numbers, and they seem to each have a life of their own. And in that context, where we don't have a firm theoretical understanding of the problem, and where public policy offers different options that are in some sense officially sanctioned because they're produced by the statistical agency, it's easy to get into a situation where people can cherry pick. What is at the core of this is setting that threshold involves a value judgment. And it's not just a theoretical economic argument to be made or a statistical argument. And I'll remind you of a quote or something that the former chief statistician Ivan Falegi wrote when we were in the middle of this sort of debate in the late 1990s. I'll let you read that, but what Falegi is responding to is he was drawn, or the statistical agency was drawn into a debate about poverty just as the issue was heating up. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was an all-party resolution to end child poverty by the year 2000. The federal government was ramping up to address child poverty with a number of innovative policies. A data infrastructure was being focused on, and obviously stakeholders were using the statistics that Statistics Canada was producing to motivate the conversation. And according to some of these statistics, poverty was on the rise. And Falegi was responding to the fact that, well, as an objective agency, we don't actually produce poverty numbers, to tell you the truth. You'll have to go out there and make your own value judgments and decide, and I'll give you the shopping a list that you can choose from. And still now, to some measure, Statistics Canada is perspective on this whole issue is very close consultation with stakeholders, giving users what they want, sort of come to the store and we'll produce the statistics for you to some degree. He's underscoring that perhaps the measurement of poverty is time specific. So one aspect of that value judgment is just in what place and in what time. So I just sort of want to highlight that. For me, poverty means having the minimal, to be out of poverty means not having the minimal resources necessary to participate normally in society. So we can have a debate about what those resources are, and we can have a debate about what normal means and in which society. And so I think to move this forward, we have to be very explicit about our values and put them on the table. What does normal mean? Barber also cautions us about this mechanical use of statistics and not to forget the underlying moral purpose, the lived experiences of citizens that the statistics are supposed to represent. So, upon reflection, we sort of took or established 3 principles by which we would judge different poverty lines or prospective poverty lines. The statistic had to be meaningful. That is, it had to, in a concrete way, reflect the lives that citizens lead. Now, part of meaningful is also a communications aspect. There's a communications aspect to it as well. So we had to be able to explain the statistic to Canadians. It had to be measurable. So of all the proposed statistics, of all the proposed measures, they had to be in some sense feasible to produce in a statistically accurate way. And finally, I'm going to use this term movable. They, in some sense, had to be sensitive to the drivers of poverty and to policy actions. So if the government pulls on a lever and it has an effect, the statistic in a timely way has to be able to pick that up. So I've taken these 3 M's from actually some of the work in one of the central agencies in the government. And this is where I was struck by Minister Duclos's leadership, was just the extent of the engagement with Canadians in this process. And again, I'll let you look at this graphic describing it. But ultimately, meaning and legitimacy came from a conversation with Canadians, and particularly Canadians with lived experiences. All right? So in some measure, while certainly consulting and dealing with the provinces and with stakeholders, he jumped over everybody as well and actually spoke to Canadians in many different forms. And this, it seems to me, cuts through a lot of the academic debate. At least it helped me cut through a lot of the academic debate on what poverty is, just by hearing Canadians. And I and others were struck in particular by a particular project called Tackling Poverty Together, which basically you could think of as a series of case studies in 6 different communities in Canada, from Yellowknife to Regent Park, Trois-Rivières to Tisdale, Saskatchewan, in which there were really intensive focus groups. And there was a lot of themes emerged from that conversation. There were a series of roundtables with stakeholders. The minister also established an advisory body of about 12 to 15 individuals. And 2/3 of them, I would say, were representatives of or people with lived experience. And they were joined with people with academic and public policy experience. So just the extensive public engagement gave meaning to measurement. And I just sort of stood back in my office during this while this happened, and just sort of marveled at the efficiency of the public servants that I was working with, and how they managed this whole process. At one point, I realized in this poverty reduction team, I guess I was 6 months in, I had been around the longest. There had been a senior retirement, another person left for another job, and one of the directors also left for another job, and an analyst left. The whole staff turned over in that process, and yet not a hiccup. The thing just sort of ran like a smooth machine. I was terribly impressed with just sort of the efficiency of that apparatus. The other thing that gave meaning to the poverty reduction strategy were the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so Canada has another agenda on the international stage, and the minister made clear that we had to sort of think in the terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 1 is no poverty. The goal is to eliminate poverty in sort of an absolute sense, but it also requires nation states, parties to develop domestic poverty lines and seek to set targets, specific targets around those. And so both the domestic engagement with Canadians and our international engagement help bring meaning to the kinds of measures that we decided upon. And so what was meaningful, if you read through the documents, if you listen to what the stakeholders were saying, 3 themes emerged. What people were saying is, I have a right to live with dignity. All right? And part of that involves meeting basic needs, like health needs, housing needs, and food security. Okay? Just that fundamental dignity that every citizen has a right to. The other theme that you hear was this sort of continual struggle for upward movement, for movement out of poverty. The kinds of energies that people described in their day-to-day lives is just terribly impressive. And so the second theme is about creating opportunity. And part of that is not just sort of opportunity in the old way, but just belonging, being recognized as a community member. And so, you know, we as academics might put this under the label of social inclusion. But opportunity and community are also part of meaning. And the third theme that emerges from these discussions is just sort of one of resilience, okay? Of having life hit you with shocks and being able to deal with those shocks, of preventing poverty, all right? So if you're an economist, the way I see it is we're talking here about the stock, the outflow, and preventing the inflow. But obviously there's more moral purpose than that. So that's what meaning was sort of encapsulated as. Measurable, as I said, is it's fine to have this vision of what a meaningful measure is, but practically we have to get some statistics on the ground. What do we have, and what do we have in a statistically meaningful way with nationally representative statistics that have reasonable confidence intervals so that policymakers can have some certainty as to how these statistics are moving. That can be used for subgroup analyses, certainly at the provincial level, but also provincial and territorial levels, but also even at the municipal and smaller geographies, and for different demographic groups. Okay? So clearly, when we engaged with Statistics Canada, there were several long reports written scoping out the field, and part of that came out of this was an ethic of continual improvement. So part of what the poverty reduction strategy does is also offer directions for continually improving our statistical apparatus. But if we've got a meaningful indicator, it also has to be feasible to measure. And finally, as I said, it has to be movable. And one part of movable is timeliness. So we have to produce these statistics in a timely way. So it's sort of a bit disconcerting that historically the poverty statistics were produced with 18-month or more lags to them. That is, I think, a concern that Statistics Canada heard and is moving very strongly on. After all, we have an unemployment rate on a monthly basis. We have GDP figures that come out quarterly. We care, too, about the income distribution, about inequality and poverty, and so maybe we should really think about the timeliness of those statistics and be very innovative in them. And then, as I said, the statistic has to be sensitive to a policy development, okay? So the minister has gone out and introduced a national housing strategy. How will that be picked up in the statistics, okay? Or at least potentially. I mean, if it has no effect, we want statistics to show that, but potentially if it does have effect, we want the statistics to show that as well. So how many people in Canada are poor? Well, you've got three possible statistics here. The blue one tells you that poverty has been on the slide for decades and is now in sort of like the 8 or 9% area. And if you buy into this statistic, you wonder why you need a poverty reduction strategy. We seem to be doing pretty well without one. The red one is another one that you can download from the Statistics Canada website, and it's been drifting up with a spike in 2015 all the way up to 14%. So that's a pretty wide range, somewhere from 8, 9 to 14% of Canadians. This is where one aspect of value judgments sort of come in. All right, I said poverty is what it takes to live. To be out of poverty means that you have enough resources to live normally in society. So, which society are we talking about? This blue line, which Statistics Canada calls the low-income cutoff, and has its
birth in the 1960s. It was informed by what was happening in the United States, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. The low-income cutoff, for no real reason, just for the arbitrary reason that some of the underlying surveys were canceled and redesigned, fixes what it takes to live normally in 1992. So the way to interpret that statistic is you don't have enough resources, if you're in poverty according to this statistic, to live normally according to the consumption patterns of 1992, okay? So when we went out and conducted the Tackling Poverty Together project, had stakeholder meetings in Thunder Bay and in Toronto and in communities around the world, nobody was living in 1992. They were living in 2015 and 2016, and they had to participate in that society. Okay? This statistic, the red line, which the Statistics Canada calls the low-income measure, does the opposite. It updates every year. All right? So it is defined as a threshold according to 1/2 of the median income. You don't have, you're in poverty if you don't have half as much as someone halfway up the income distribution. Okay? And that, I think, speaks to a lot of people who see poverty as an aspect of social inclusion. What this statistic really is, and what it should be used for, is it's the degree of inequality in the lower half of the income distribution. Okay? You could drive that statistic to 0, like some of the Nordic countries have. In Denmark and Norway and in Finland, this number is less than 5%. And it's often used in that sense to offer cross-country comparisons. So the United States has a poverty rate, according to this measure, that's very similar to that in Bulgaria. Okay? But people might feel that this entirely relative measure really doesn't capture the absolute standard of living in countries. My beef with it, and the beef with some academics, is that it updates every year. So the median changes from year to year, and so the poverty line changes from year to year. So let's imagine, as we did in the early 1990s, we go into a very severe recession, and median incomes fall. What happens to the poverty line during a recession? It goes down. All right? And so that's why, after we went into this recession, in part, the response of this statistic was very muted compared to this statistic which fixed the poverty line in 1992. All right? It did a good job of actually picking up what was happening there. All right? So yes, what it takes to participate normally in society evolves, but it doesn't evolve a year to year. It evolves sort of slowly, sort of perhaps, well, 2006, 2016 is not 2006. It's not 1996. Societies change, but they change gradually. Okay, and so in response to these implicit value judgments, some economists have been arguing for something in between. Not too hot, not too cold, just right, by taking a 5-year moving average of the median income. And that sort of permits the poverty line to adjust slowly and regularly. After all, Canadians feel that our society changes enough over a 5-year horizon that we conduct a census every 5 years to get a snapshot of our society. And so if you took sort of a 5-year moving average of the median income, and every year set that as the poverty line, you would get this gray line here. Okay? So Michael Wolfson, one of the architects of this low-income measure, has argued for this 5-year moving average, as have others. And I very much felt that this was a more appropriate measure. Okay, so you get a question in the House, and you stand up to explain the new poverty line that the academics propose, and you start talking about 5-year moving averages, and it's a bit of a communications strategy, all right? So maybe it's not the best poverty line for that. There is another measure Statistics Canada produces called the market basket measure, okay? And when we look at that measure, it seems to track our 5-year moving average line quite closely. And so as an academic, that sort of sold me on this. But the market basket measure, in some degree, is much more meaningful because it actually reflects the consumption patterns of Canadians. Well, let me pull back a little to that. It's based upon the consumption patterns of a Canadian family of 2 adults and 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl of a particular age. Okay? And it is regularly updated. Well, at least it's been updated once in the past, so it reflects those consumption patterns in 2011. And this market basket measure is the one that the minister felt was most appropriate as Canada's official poverty line. And so henceforth, we can now answer that question. As I just said, the last update was in 2011. So the poverty reduction strategy, in the sense of continual improvement, will institute a rule in which this official poverty line will be updated every 5 years. This is very different than what happened in the United States when it set up an official poverty line, which was sort of frozen in time, reflecting the consumption patterns of 1958. Okay, and that statistic being placed in the White House was always very hard to update. And so this updating exercise is going to be placed in Statistics Canada and be conducted in sort of an apolitical way. So the updating is important. Okay, I've hinted at other ways that it can be improved, and Statistics Canada is in the middle now of doing a consultation for these updates. Okay, and we can talk a little bit about that. But this graphic describes the official poverty line. The other thing that's important is that the basket of goods that are costed are measured for about 50 different communities across the country. All right? So we have a much better geographic sensitivity in this measure than we have in the alternatives. Where it is highest, that line is about $41,000. And the community where it's lowest, it's about $33,000. Again, for that family of 4. All right. We use, economists call, an equivalence scale to make that a personal line. So if you're thinking about an individual, just cut these figures in half. All right. So you are poor in Canada if, as an individual, if you were living on your own, your income was, depending upon where you lived, somewhere between $16,000 and $20,000 annually. The other thing I want to point out, it reflects the costing of a typical basket of some primary goods like clothing, transportation, food, and shelter. All of these things came up in the engagement and the consultations. This is what people with lived experience talked about. Okay? Transportation is also crucial in some parts of the country. And I'm not sure when we get to the supporting indicators, we were able to get a specific indicator of that. But it is embedded in the official poverty line. Some people might think because the poverty line is based upon costing a specific basket of goods, it makes it in some sense an absolute line. That's not exactly the case because there's just sort of a top-up for other goods. And these are sort of measured in sort of a relative sense. These are a bit out of date. For example, the other good you need to participate normally in society is a cell phone, access to the internet. And that's not in there yet. But these goods will sort of evolve according to overall consumption patterns as well. So what the updating will do is it will update the costing of these baskets
So for example, in the transportation component, when this statistic was officially put forward, there were included the costs of operating a used car if you lived in a community that didn't have public transport. And they went to a specific car. I think it was the General Motors Cavalier, all right? But now that model has been discontinued. So now there's sort of updating is forced upon the statistical agency because the basket is sort of changing according to the availability of goods. But what it takes to participate normally will evolve, and the basket will be updated every 5 years. So you should think of the official poverty line as speaking to the fundamental needs of Canadians, but also their relative needs. It's meaningful in this sense, and it's measurable. So, how many Canadians are poor? In 2015, the year this government began its mandate, about 4.2 million Canadians. Okay? And that's about 1 in every 8, about 12%. And so we can frame, or at least if you have leadership, you can frame the conversation around those numbers. And hopefully we move beyond the stage of cherry picking and debating the facts and have a consensus now about what to do about this as opposed to what it is. And you can go to StatsCan website, as I did in preparing this presentation, and I just sort of cut and paste this document. You can see that you can get it for different subgroups. I've highlighted that for individuals who consider children, people under 18 years of age, and also for people above 65. For people older than 65, the poverty rate is about 5%. All right, so if you put sort of standard errors around that, I'm not sure you can get it much lower. Whereas for children, it's 2-3 times as high. That sort of might help you or guide a policy as to what priorities might be. The other important thing is whether you are in an economic family or you're living on your own. All right, the great neglected group, I think, in poverty conversations, and which should be a focus of attention moving forward, is unattached individuals living on their own. They have a poverty rate of close to 30%, according to this statistic. So that's, in some sense, in broad measure, guiding policy. These are the targets. When the government took office, the official poverty line was about 12%. If you go to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, an intermediate target is reducing the poverty line by 20% by 2020. So that's where this comes from. It also adds up. If each new government, roughly every 5 years, took the poverty line it inherited and lowered it by 20%, we would see us at a poverty line of about 6% in 2030. So the two targets are lower the poverty rate to 10% by 20%, actually worded lower the poverty rate by 20% by 2020. The line could be, as I said, updated, and so those percentages could change. So what 20% means might change. But right now it means getting the poverty rate to 10%. If this government does that, that will be a historic low in this statistic. Okay? And in its first year of government, we did notice a drop in this statistic. Now, obviously, one data point doesn't make a trend, but we're approaching that target. Moving down to this area, in my view, is going to require a lot more thinking with a whole different suite of policy options that the poverty reduction strategy itself doesn't tell you what to do. How long do I have in terms of time? Is it 1 o'clock we end up?
Well, yeah, 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
Everyone disappears.
Everyone disappears. So let me just sort of, maybe let me just talk about the 3 pillars, and then I'll end it there so we have 10 minutes for questions. Is that okay? So the other thing we know is that Poverty is not just about numbers. People speak about income. People speak about distinct things. And we know that there's a multidimensional sense to poverty. And so there are 3 sets of supporting indicators that help condition or help us to interpret those targets. The first are associated with the theme of dignity. We have indicators of food insecurity. So if we're fighting income poverty and we're not doing something about food insecurity, something's wrong. Okay? We have indicators of unmet health needs. We have indicators of unmet housing. And we have a deep income poverty line. So the deep income poverty line is roughly, it translates to 3/4 of the official poverty line. All right? And what we did to get that number was just look at the components that spoke to those commodities, leaving out those other things that I said were relative. That comes out to a poverty line that's about 73% of the official line. The deep income poverty line is important. So those at the very bottom of the tail, all right? You could take money from them and give them to people just below the official poverty line, impoverish the really poor, and give those living just below the threshold an extra $1 or $2 that moves them above the threshold, and you will have lowered the poverty rate. Okay? And so that's an indication of where the moral purpose of the statistic is being abused, and where you can see politicians sort of gaming the numbers to make progress on these statistics. So we also want to see continual improvement in deep poverty as a condition of hitting those targets. We have a set of indicators that refer to opportunity inclusion. Very good statistics and numbers on the literacy and numeracy skills of 15-year-olds. Measures of youth engagement, what the OECD calls the NEAT, not in employment, education, or training. And relative low income, which is that low income poverty measure that I told you about as well. So it's part of the inclusion package. And there's a set of indicators that refer to resilience and security. My own view is we sort of lose a little bit of the coherence here. We might be thinking of these statistics, rethinking them. These are really meant to refer to people who aren't in poverty, the middle class, if you will, but who sort of feel threatened and insecure and could fall into poverty. Are their lives more secure and better? Can they handle shocks? Finally, in terms of a contract for future generations, what we do have is intermediate and longer-term targets. Those longer-term targets span this government. There is an apparatus or an infrastructure for measurement and monitoring progress. So every time these statistics are released, we should be able to hold the government's feet to its fire. The strategy also proposes to put into place a national advisory committee on poverty that will be responsible for bringing the community together, a community of stakeholders together, and monitoring progress with an official report. And the strategy, we were told, is going to be embodied in legislation. So this is where I was sort of talking about next steps. We haven't seen that yet in its form. Unfortunately, it hasn't yet been part of a broader debate. I sort of wonder about how strong a contract can be with future government if it just relies on legislation. It has to, in some sense, sort of reflect a change in social attitudes that hold that legislation. But either way, the legislation hasn't been tabled yet. It's going to be a crowded agenda this fall. If it's part of the Budget Implementation Act or for the 2018 budget, that might be where it comes in, or it might be in the next budget, or it might be on standalone legislation itself. That hasn't been figured out yet, and I think as engaged citizens, we should watch that space. So maybe I can open it to questions now, if Riley, if that's okay. All right. I had a little clip that I wanted to show you of Minister MacLeod, but if you go to my Twitter feed, you can pick up on that. She, in a speech 2 days ago, actually used the framing, dignity, opportunity, and resilience. But how that guides her policy, obviously, is sort of open to conversation.
thank you very much. I think we can all. Stand where I can sit.
Oh, I can sit.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you want to sit?
I'll read from over here. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, so you've got the questions there? Oh,
And they're behind you as well.
Oh, great.
So the first question is, how would you describe the reality of lone parents?
Oh, okay. That's a great question because the situation of lone parents has evolved a lot. So I sort of give you the high-level statistics in the poverty reduction strategy. It's meant to support a whole series of statistics. So we certainly expect the numbers for lone parents to be released. If you look strictly at income-based measures, there's actually been last time I looked at the numbers, some significant improvement in the situation of lone parents in terms of poverty. But this is also where I think, so it's a more heterogeneous crowd that has evolved over the last 10 or 15 years. Poverty rates have fallen somewhat. I think you want to cut into this a little bit more. There's an immigrant slice. And the other dimension is just sort of the limitations of just looking at an income-based measure. Time stress is really a very important issue, and so we should look to policies beyond income as well to speak to that. The other thing is we should have definite concerns about the children in this situation. The Canada Child Benefit, I think, is a major step forward that's probably going to be biting really nicely in this space because of the a certain phase of unconditional benefits and a tapering of benefits that really goes far out into the income distribution, on top of it all being more generous. So that's sort of a group actually to be monitoring, and I'm sure the government is doing that because it'll speak directly to what it views as one of its major policy innovations. Trouble is, I don't know if that's a good answer for the person who asked it, but
no, I think that is great. So our next question here is, what do you think the first steps are in steering away from a victim-blaming mentality, for example, that poverty is a result of some sort of deficiency of the person?
I very much appreciate that question, and that is a theme that repeatedly came out in the consultations. So summarizing it with that word dignity is that this is what people were very much calling for. Some of the ministers in the government, particular Minister Haidu, very much takes leadership around this issue. I don't know how to offer advice on that, but as an analyst, I think you want to keep sharp antennae on this issue. When you hear politicians speaking, ask yourself, do they talk about the poor, or do they talk about citizens who are poor, Canadians who are poor? And that'll be a cue for you to tell you sort of some of the sort of the knee-jerk directions in which people may be going. I'd also sort of direct you to some of the work at the Harvard Kennedy School that David Elwood and others are leading around opportunity and poverty. And they very much are trying to, with ethnographic studies and other work, tackle that issue.
Is there anyone in the audience who has a question for Dr. Corak? All right, back to the board then.
It's such a quiet crowd. I only hear myself. This is not. This is cool.
So the next question up is, you mentioned the national housing strategy. Could you discuss why housing in particular has such far-reaching implications on poverty and poverty reduction?
This is an area that obviously is going to be of different concern for people living in different parts of the country. First of all, it seems like shelter is a fundamental right that everyone has. It's certainly part of the UN Convention. And if you don't have that kind of private space, it preconditions everything else. I don't know enough of the details of the national housing strategy to talk about how it will actually concretely affect that. But in terms of the poverty reduction strategy, it was certainly a backdrop that we had in mind. The government, when Minister Duclos released the poverty reduction strategy, received some criticism for not putting something new on the table in terms of policy. I don't think people appreciated that this government, since day one, had been conducting a poverty reduction strategy. And what it was doing, and the national housing strategy took a good deal of the minister's energy and time and capital, and very extensive engagements with partners around the country. And so my understanding is that it's seen as a important step forward.
So what is your opinion on the minimum wage increase? When do you think the results of this policy will show, and will it be effective in reducing poverty in the long term?
Right. So there's a lot of debate in the economics literature around the minimum wage, and it's often framed in terms of its impact on on unemployment. So just how many jobs are quote unquote lost as a result of this. The economic conversation around that, you have to understand it in terms of, are we talking about the short term, are we talking about the long term, and how credible some of the evidence is. I think there's reasonable evidence to say, at least in the short term, it doesn't have much impact on employment levels, but it does scrunch up the income distribution at the lower end, and affect the incomes of some. Whether they're actually in poverty or not is another thing. But I recently came across, in reading a new book by Isabel Sawhill that I'll recommend to you, from the Brookings Institution. And like a good policy thinker, she wrote this book, came up with these great ideas. Then almost as an afterthought, she took her ideas to communities around the United States, 4 or 5 different communities, to talk about the forgotten Americans in her view. So these are people without a university education and making incomes in the lower half of the income distribution, and who are working really quite hard. And many of them were against the minimum wage because they felt they were just above it, and they have all this seniority that isn't getting paid, or not getting any pay increases, and then someone's just walking in all of a sudden making almost as much as them. Now, economists actually talk about ripple effects of the minimum wage moving up the distribution, but these people felt it sort of a sense of fairness. So I think you have to sort of be aware of that political dimension, where there could be a sort of backlash against you as well for raising the minimum wage. Okay.
Given that we're right at time here, I think it would be best to call it there. So I'd like to invite everybody to once again thank Dr. Corak for his talk.